Well, on the second Sunday of July in 2011, was my first Sunday here as your pastor. And on that Sunday, you may not remember this, but I sat on the steps and I reached down and took off my shoes, which I'm doing again this morning. I took off my shoes and I said to you that when I was married, I was barefoot. When I was ordained, I was barefoot. When I'm buried, I've asked to be buried barefoot. And as I left my Legrand appointment, I took off my shoes because I had been in all of those places on holy ground. And as I was coming into your life and community, I knew that I was entering holy ground. And so this day, as I get ready to depart, I take off my shoes again, recognizing and celebrating and giving thanks for the holy ground that we have walked together. And I don't know if you, when you were a kid, ever did something that your parents were so just apoplectic about, just so beside themselves, they could only sort of grab you by the scruff of the neck and take you to wherever the thing was that you had done, the mess that you had made, the thing you had broken, and they could barely put words. They just, look what you've done. It never happened to me, of course, but I remember seeing that happen to my sister all the time. That's not true. I mean, it probably did happen to my sister, and it happened with me on occasion. And I bet it happened with some of you. Would you just look at what you've done? And I think sadly, very often, that's the image that we carry of God. An angry and disappointed voice who points out the messes that we made, the mistakes that we've made, the problems that we've caused, the damage that we've done, and said, look at what you've done. And there's a sense of shame and guilt in that, a shame of anger and fear in that. And it is absolutely true that there are times when, especially through the voices of the prophets, God speaks to the people of Israel and says, look at what you've done. Primarily, God speaks in those moments to the religious and political leaders when they have wandered far from the way of life to which they are called and committed as God's people. So there are times when God speaks and says with that voice of urgency, look what you've done. See the problem, see the brokenness, see the hurt. But I also think that God sometimes says those words to us, look what you've done, but not as a disappointed or angry voice, but as a patient, loving, proud parent or friend. Look what you've done. So often we don't see in our own lives, I suspect, the impact that we have, the positive impact that we have, the great things that have happened because of something we've said or done. We very seldom get to see that. And sometimes we have to have someone else point that out to us. Look what you've done. Do you see how great this is? I just saw a story the other day, and I can't remember who the original author was, but he was a writer of some prominence. Oh, it was Neil Gaiman. He's a comic book and young readers and other science fiction and fantasy kind of writer. And he was at some big hullabaloo with lots of important people, and he felt sort of out of place, even though he was a well-known and well-established writer. And he found himself in the back of the room talking with another person who was also sort of shrunk back from the congregation of people who were milling around and being important together. And Neil Gaiman says to this other person, I feel so out of place here. And this other person, also named Neil, says, me too. I never know what to do with these things. All these people have done so much. They've written books, they've started companies, they've been the captains of industry, and I feel so completely like all I did is go where people send me. And Neil Gaiman says, yes, but you were the first person to set foot on the moon. I think that counts for something. So if Neil Armstrong can sometimes feel out of place, and some people have to remind him of the good that he's done, the importance that he's had, we all need that sometimes. Sometimes we need to be the voice for one another about the good work that we've done. 11 years is a long time to be appointed as a United Methodist pastor, and I am so grateful for the time that we've had. And I am so grateful for those folks who came before me, and especially for the incredible work that Gwen did in the years before I came here. For those of you who might be newer to the church, you don't know that prior to Gwen and a couple of interim pastors who came in, there was a crisis in this church that would have threatened to sort of split the church, and it did have some long-term challenges for us. But because of Gwen's great work to heal this congregation, to set some things in motion, to begin to cast a vision and plant some seeds, my work these last 11 years has been so much easier. I've been thinking a lot in these last several months, but especially the last couple of weeks, about what it means to be the pastor of a church. And I've tried lots of different metaphors of conduit and connector and catalyst. But one that seems to fit often for me is it's like being the guide on a river raft for a whitewater rafting trip. I've never done that work myself, but I've been on some whitewater rafting trips with the senior high adventure camp, and the guide sits up a little higher in the back of the boat, and they sort of get to steer the boat a bit. But really the work of the guide is to know the river, to be able to see maybe what's coming, but also just because of experience and because they have learned from other guides, they get to help those in the boat navigate down the river to get through the rapids safely. Sometimes the guide will know that there's a dangerous rock there just under the surface that if you hit it could turn the boat over. Or they might know, hey, there's a really great rapid, just everybody steer left. But they can't do it on their own. No matter how much the guide tries to steer with their paddle, they really need the people in the boat to also use their gifts, their skills, their strength to turn the boat and get it to go where it needs to go. And that's kind of what it feels like to be a pastor, partly because it is often a wild and adventurous ride, and also because so much of the work that happens is people working as a team. And even then, it is less about deciding where the boat goes and more about going with the flow of the river, navigating a little bit carefully to avoid some of the worst bumps and rocks, but mostly just to enjoy the trip and the ride. If you try to fight across a river or up a river, you'll never get anywhere. But if you go with the flow, if you follow the direction of the river, if you listen to the voice of the Spirit, it becomes a joyful ride. There's been so much that we've done together these last 11 years, and I want to be really clear that so much of that work and so much of the best work that we've done has not been me. It's not been anything that I've started or have led. In fact, one of the things that I celebrate is that as I leave this appointment and go to my next, is that there are very few things that are going to stop because I've left. In fact, I can't think of anything that's currently happening that will stop because I'm leaving. I don't think the role of the pastor is to do the ministry, but rather to support and encourage and equip people for ministry. And you have been extraordinary ministers of the gospel in so many ways. As I think back about the things that have shifted and turned, I can think of some key moments when it just seemed like things unfolded rightly. Some of the work we did early on was making our building a little more welcoming. We transformed the narthex so that it was a more welcoming space. And what was a sort of dim and cluttery feeling space became a place for gathering and meeting. And people who were leaving this group or coming in for this meeting would often cross paths. And more than once, I've seen connections being made at the tables in our narthex, new relationships being formed, new connections being made between people in two different groups who share our building. And that's one of the other things that's been extraordinary, is that early on we began to welcome folks into our space very intentionally. We started talking about ministry partners in our community rather than outside groups. And just thinking about them a little bit differently became a catalyst for engaging with our community differently. Prior to the COVID pandemic, this building was full every day, every week, There were hundreds of folks throughout this building who never set foot on into a Sunday morning worship service, but who thought of this as being a place of sanctuary, of connection, of relationship, of safety, of healing, of hope, of joy. Do you see what you've done? There are people who don't have a church home except this one. And you wouldn't know them because they're not here on Sundays maybe, but they have found a connection here. Not just in the building, but in the hospitality that you create. Do you see what you've done? Early on in my first year or two, Gan Clarkson was the SPR chair, and he calls and says, "Hey, can we go to lunch?" And oh no! I was afraid that something had gone wrong, that I was in trouble, or that there was some significant issue that needed to be dealt with. And we had lunch, Gan and I, and he begins to talk about, we had, I think, 2 or 3 12-step groups then, and there was an arrangement supposed to be in place about childcare for those 12-step groups. They were going to provide one volunteer. We would provide, as a church, another volunteer. And those 2 volunteers together, meeting our safe sanctuary requirements, would be the childcare for those meetings that were happening, those Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous meetings. And Gan was explaining how hard this had been, and it hadn't really ever worked because either one of our volunteers would forget, or they didn't have a volunteer, and it just was never quite coming together. And as he was explaining the difficulties of this and how long we had worked to make it happen, I assumed he was about to say, "We've got to quit trying to do this. It's just too frustrating." And I was getting ready for a fight, man. I was assembling all my arguments, and I was about ready to put my foot down and say, "We can't give up on this." And I was so ready because I knew that this church had the possibility to do something extraordinary in our community. And if we start not welcoming people, it felt like such a giant step backwards. And so I was ready, and then Gan finishes explaining the difficulties and the challenges of this. And he says, "So I was thinking, what if we just provided childcare? We didn't ask them to provide a volunteer. That way they can all be in the meeting they need to be in, and they can have a safe place for their kids." Yeah, that's a great idea. That was the genesis for what became Blast Off. We had a staff member at that time, Christine Webb, who had the gifts and the skills and the passion and compassion necessary to do that work. And she started Blast Off on Wednesday and Thursday evenings. And I would ask her every day after Blast Off, like, "How many kids do we have?" She said, "Oh, we had 3 kids last night." "Oh, that's great." That was the first week. The second week, she said, "We have 5 kids. It was really fun." "Oh, that's amazing." The third week, she said, "We had like 8 kids." I said, "That is so cool." And then on the 4th week, I'm at home at 7:00 on a Thursday, and I get a phone call, and it's Christine. And she says, "There are like 25 or 30 kids here. We need help." And I jumped in the car, and I came down, and a few others of you had been called in, and we cared for those kids. And that moment became such a transformative moment for us. It sounds like such a simple thing, an hour or so of childcare for people in an addiction recovery group. But that's not what our 12-step siblings experience in so many other churches. People began to come to 12-step meetings at this building because they heard about the childcare and the love with which they were treated. People came from 20 and 30 and 40 miles away. Women who were leaving prison were telling other women who were leaving prison, "I heard there's this church on the west side that has childcare for 12-step recovery groups." Do you see what you've done? It's an extraordinary thing. It sounds so simple and so easy, and yet it made such a tremendous difference. There are so many other ways that you have made a huge impact in our community and in our world. Muffin ministry, the backpacks, the expansion of the backpack ministries. When the schools needed to expand, when Lincoln Street to expand their backpack program, they called and said, could you? Yes, we can. And then when Newberry knew that they needed somebody else to step into their backpack ministry, we were the first church they called because they knew that we would say yes. And so children and their families who might otherwise struggle at the end of the month when paychecks are running short have had good, healthy food. Do you see what you've done? There are so many ways that you have made such an extraordinary impact. We became a reconciling congregation, saying clearly and without any doubt that all of God's children, regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender identity or expression or their immigration status or their language, that they were all welcome. And there are people who are part of our congregation now who may not have joined if we had not said boldly and clearly, you are loved as you are. There is nothing wrong with you. We celebrate who God has made you to be. And even folks who've not been in worship in our community, when they hear about reconciling churches like ours, it makes a difference. I've had a number of people in our community reach out and say, I am not a Christian, or I'm feeling really burned by my religious upbringing, but I want you to know how much it means to know that there's a church out there where I could be welcomed. Do you see what you've done? There's so much good work. So it's absolutely true that I believe that ministry is the work of the people, not the pastor. And in almost all of these cases, there's very little that I've done except to encourage and cheerlead and connect when sometimes this person and this person and this person have the same dream that the Spirit is stirring up in them. But really, it's been your work. But there was one moment, this is my moment. When Claire was born, I got to be excused from annual conference, which is great fun. It's like playing hooky from school. And we went to annual conference anyway, just for an hour, just to say hi to some friends and let them see Claire and all of that. She was only a couple of months old at that point. And I walked into the big, huge hotel in Boise, where it was, the big lobby area. And as I'm walking across to go say hi to friends, I hear from across the way someone yelling, "Clay!" And I turn around and it's Peg Losfold, who was our district superintendent at the time. And we chatted for a minute. She says, "I'm so glad you're here." Okay, me too. She said, "We, as the cabinet, sort of unexpectedly have been connected with a new pastor from Michigan. He's originally from Honduras. We want to bring him in to be a new church plant starter in Washington County. But we don't know where he's going to land or where he'll have an office and a space. Can Hillsboro host him?" Now, this was the middle of June, and the appointment started July 1st. I was on paternity leave, so I had not been in contact with the board or with the church very much. But I said, yes, we could do that, because I knew that we were committed to welcoming all of God's children. And then I got on the email and emailed the board and said, okay, so here's what I did. I committed us to hosting this thing. But what a moment it has been. To say yes to that became such an opportunity to connect with our communities in new, better, deeper ways. We didn't know when I said yes to hosting a new congregation that it would evolve into what's happening now with merging two congregations. But the Spirit moved. And we steered a little bit left and a little bit right, and we found the spot where God was calling us. And now there are people who are part of our congregation who would not have been otherwise. And there's work happening in our congregation, in our community, that never could happen otherwise in an English-only church. Do you see what you've done? hard work. It's slow work. It's pioneering work. And it's the work to which we are called. And I cannot wait to see and celebrate with you along the way. I'll be celebrating a little bit from afar, but I want you to know that I will be praying with you as you journey through the next months and years together with Jorge as your pastor. That passage from Luke's Gospel, Luke 4, where Jesus reads the scroll from Isaiah, he's talking about what he's outlining at the beginning of his ministry, what he is called to. Recovery of sight to the blind, release to the prisoners, freedom for the captives and the oppressed, healing and wholeness for all of God's people. We've used that quite often in worship. We use it almost every year at our annual board retreat as a standard by which we sort of examined our life and ministry together at the Hillsboro United Methodist Church. Because as much as we want the gospel to be about what we believe or what we say or what we profess, Jesus is really clear at the beginning of his own ministry that his gospel is about who is healed, who is welcomed and received, who is made whole, who is set free. That's the work we are called to, brothers and sisters. Work that transforms our community, that transforms our church, that transforms us as we journey together. Do you see what you've done? What a joy these last 11 years have been. What an extraordinary, unexpected number of ways that we have found the Spirit calling us and moving us. I am grateful for your work, for the life and ministry that we've shared together. I'm grateful to have walked on this holy ground with you. And I cannot wait to see where the Spirit leads you next. And that, my friends, is God's good news this day. Thanks be to God. Amen.